Let's take a look at API design. When you think about the old operating model, it was really just about production. How can we get things into production as quick as possible? And we took a lot of shortcuts. One shortcut was on API design itself. It was just get it done and we'll worry about the future later. In that wild, wild west kind of environment, every developer created their own API spec out here for whatever they were going to expose. There was no reuse, there was no standardization, and that led to no commonality across APIs. When we look at some examples of that, if we had information stored in Salesforce, however that was represented in Salesforce is typically how the developer exposes that through their API. So the API exposing account data out of Salesforce looks different than what comes out of SAP and what comes out of a database. And that makes it hard for consumers when we start thinking about all those applications that want to consume account information from these three systems. Now they have to do all this orchestration and worry about what protocols to use and which APIs to call and all this kind of stuff in order to aggregate all that information. So very hard on the consuming side of this. But we did it quickly, and in a lot of places that's what people are more focused on than the actual bigger impact, which is how can we make it easy to consume APIs. And so as we think about the worst practice example, and you can check out a worst practice example at the location you see down here at the bottom, but the developer experience is horrible. Their consumer experience, I should say, is just horrible. They have to wade through hundreds of lines of code typically to figure out what an API does, and that just makes it hard. There's no reuse of data types. It's kind of like the Stone Age. Every developer is creating their own data type out here, their own resource types, their own message types, their own security schemes, and so on. So even though we may have account information being exposed from multiple systems, it all looks different, and every developer is wasting time because they're not leveraging any reuse. There's no standardization. Again, everybody's doing their own thing, so everyone does it different. It's not anything intentional, it's just that's the nature of people. They do it the way they know, and therefore everyone does it differently. And so it's all a custom code, custom work that's done versus some sort of assembly line where we could do these things quickly. And then on the consumer side, because everybody's doing it differently, there's no commonality. Each API looks different, so I have to go and figure out what an API does before I can actually use it. And that's because each one used their own different data types and so on, as we've talked about before. Now, when we think about the impact of this, APIs don't work together. It's like that bridge you see here. It didn't work out the way we intended. That's because we didn't follow the same specs that were out there. It's a very brittle ecosystem because everyone has to understand every API, and there's nothing that insulates consumers from those back-end systems. So it's a very brittle ecosystem that we've introduced. And as we've talked about, a poor user experience because we don't have any standardization across those APIs. But there is a better way. And that better way is instead of focusing on production, the new operating model focuses more on the consumption side. And that allows us to actually create a marketplace of reusable assets where someone can go out in a self-service fashion, discover those assets, and register to use them, as well as provide feedback around those assets or APIs. And then the owner of those APIs gets usage metrics around it. This allows us to democratize development and increase organizational agility because now we're taking more of a consumption-focused approach than a production-focused approach. And that leads to, instead of no reuse, no standardization, and hard to consume, it leads to high reuse, much more of a factory type of approach where developers can actually accelerate their API design because they're leveraging data types and resources types and those that have already been created. They're composing APIs from these reusable assets. Now, on the consumer side, they're also be able to compose new APIs that orchestrate other APIs much more quickly because the kind of foundational APIs, if you will, are built on common components. And that makes it easier to consume. And now we're talking more about an assembly line type of approach, just like Legos, where I can put any of them together and they all fit, versus an ad hoc type of approach. And that makes it easy for the consumers. Because I have that commonality, each API looks the same. It's easy to discover and access new APIs that are out there and know how they work because they're all kind of built the same, and then rapidly compose new APIs based upon those building blocks. And that's why design first is so important. If we have that commonality, then we're able to create a pleasurable experience for our consumers instead of them scratching their head. And for example, instead of the 800 lines that we talked about before for my account API, if we follow best practices and reuse components, I can get that down to actually 25 lines, and the 25 lines you see on the screen over here, because I'm leveraging reusable components like for the security scheme and what an account looks like and how to handle a collection of records that are out there. And so with the API design, we're able to do things much more quickly than they were before. So when we think about API design, let's not think about just creating APIs as quick as possible. Let's think about how can we create reusable APIs that are easily consumable and easily understandable by anyone within the organization or external to the organization that would like to use those APIs. And that's what Design First can bring us.